So ESG is, for country or a business, it's now an unavoidable standard and it's a must. So we'll invite some experts and professionals to see where we are.
So first,
행적.
so the first speaker is Hyo-eun Kim, Ambassador of Climate Change of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Please give her a big hand.
네, 오늘 이렇게
Hello. Thank you for inviting me as a speaker. And the keynote speech and keynote session was really interesting personally, so I hope that many of you can also find my presentation interesting and informative too. So I'm given 20 minutes for my presentation. So I will set my alarm here and begin. So the title of my speech is Decade of Action for Carbon Neutrality. So from 2020 to 2030, that decade is a really critical and significant decade. And I am going to tell you why. So it begins with the Paris Agreement in 2015. As you know, Paris Agreement is also dubbed as the new climate regime. The reason it's new is that the Kyoto Protocol only mandated the advanced countries that is more responsible for GHG emissions to reduce their emissions. But now the Paris Agreement is including rather underdeveloped or developing countries as well in the pact. So climate cooperation is actually based on two principles. First, common, but second, differentiated responsibility. So climate change is something that we all have responsibility for, but we do have differentiated responsibilities. Advanced nations do have greater responsibility for this, of course, as opposed to developing countries. So that's called common but differentiated responsibility, or CDR. And we also recognize that all different countries have different capacity of responding to climate change. Particularly developing countries or sub-Saharan countries or some small island countries in the Pacific region do not have capability to fight climate change, so they need support and help. However, still, the Paris Agreement is making a groundbreaking commitment of all countries on the planet, and it recognizes that all countries on the planet are responsible for climate change mitigation. And another thing is that it is based on a very strong principle of NDC, or nationally determined contribution. Each nation can set their goal on its own, but they always need to make progress. So that's another principle, a principle of progression over time. So for example, if you say, like, I'm going to, or my country is going to reduce the emissions by 50%, and later you will say, like, oh, that's too much, I'm going to drop it to 30%. Well, that's not allowed under the Paris Agreement. You always need to make progression. That is another principle. And another important principle of Paris Agreement is MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. You have to measure, report, your emissions effort, and the result needs to be verified by a third party. So of course, you do have the rights to set your own goal. However, your goal and your promise need to be verified. And how well you are making progress on your promise must be verified by the international community or a third party. So that is a very strong principle of Paris Agreement. Our effort to fight climate change is based on science. Is climate change a scientific issue? Is it based on science and evidence? That's the question that has been pretty prevalent in the past. And to provide evidence and scientific evidence to climate change, IPCC is making assessment reports. And every time when IPCC released AR, we witnessed great development in our effort to fight climate change. For example, the first AR released in 1990 laid a foundation for the adoption of UNFCCC. And AR4, released in 2007, pushed us to adopt the Bali Action Plan. And it also made the IPCC a Nobel Peace Awardee laureate. And that was a pretty momentous event. And everybody started to believe that climate change is a phenomenon based on scientific evidence. And another important thing is that special report on 1.5 released in 2018. That is, when we were creating the Paris Agreement, the global community agreed to limit the temperature rising under 2 Celsius degrees. That was in 2015. So back then, 2 degrees was the common sense. However, in 2018, with the special report on 1.5, we learned that 2 degrees is just too much. We have to limit it to 1.5. That suggestion was also based on science and evidence. So far, the global warming was 1.1 degrees. So we only have 0.4 degrees left. So we have a very narrow window of opportunity. And AR6 Working Group 1 was released in 2021, and that laid the foundation for the adoption of Glasgow Climate Pact. So the 1.5 degrees is really, really important. According to the report from the ICCC, when the temperature rises 1.5 degrees, the frequency of abnormal heat wave that would occur once in 10 years will increase by over 4-fold. The frequency of once in 50-year abnormal heat wave will increase by 8.6 times. That means that we will have a heat wave almost every year. And what is more frightening is that if the temperature rises 2 degrees, it will become 5.6 times and 13.9 times respectively. That's what the IPCC report is saying. So 2 degrees is just too high. It should be under 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is a strong recommendation by the IPCC report. And actually, we have witnessed a lot of extreme weathers and abnormal weather events. The extreme rainfall or the water bomb that happened in Seoul was really extreme. And we couldn't handle that water because it was just too much. The draining system in Seoul or in Korea is designed to contain a certain number of water. For example, it can contain 80 millimeters of water every hour. However, that day, the water quantity was over 130 millimeters per hour. That was impossible for the draining system of the city to handle. And this is happening only with the global warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius. So if it becomes 1.5 or 2, that's going to be extremely dangerous and catastrophic. So the report is saying that global warming must be kept under 1.5 above the pre-industrial level until 2100. And for that, by 2050, emissions and reductions must strike a balance, meaning that we need to achieve carbon neutrality. And for that carbon neutrality by 2050, we need to reduce emissions by 45% of emissions from 2010 by 2030. So this is the recommendation from the IPCC. So we all need to be on track if we are to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So emissions reduction need to be 45% on average. So it could be 50% for some countries and 20% for others. However, globally and on average, we need to be at 45%. According to the AR6 Working Group 3 released this year, to achieve the 1.5 limit by 2030, if the baseline is 2019, the emissions need to fall by 43%. And we also need to reach the emission peak no later than 2025. So meaning that the emissions are growing across the world, but that should peak in 2025. After that, we need to go down. Only by that we can reduce emissions by 45% in 2030, by 2030. And I am emphasizing on this fact again and again because, some people have doubts about this trend or about this global effort. Probably if we have another president in the US, like Donald Trump, this will just go back again. Or some people think that this is just a fad. However, that is not true. This is something that will make or break our survival, and this will severely affect our future generations. We have to keep going, and we have to work on this continuously. The COP26 had a very strong goal, a strong objective. It really wanted to invite all countries around the world to make a commitment to global greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Only by that we can achieve the 45% of emissions reduction by 2030. And the UK also argued that greenhouse gas emissions reduction is not something that should be done by the government only. It requires all people from the world. So the COP26 had what we call the whole of the society approach. So here you can see that every day during the meeting, we invited various sectors of our society to have a discussion and create a common idea for greenhouse gas reductions. For example, here on Wednesday, we invited finance sector. And we said that we will not make investment in project that is harming our environment or emitting greenhouse gas emissions. And another day, for example, here on November 11th, we invited cities and regions. This day, we invited regional governments and local governments, and we pushed them to make commitments to greenhouse gas reductions. So every day, we invited different interest parties, and we pushed them to make some commitment. And this was a pretty successful approach. All sectors, all different parts of our society now understand the importance and significance of our effort to fight climate change or reduce greenhouse emissions. So the result of the COP20 is summarized on this page. You can check it on your own. But the most important result is reaffirming the strong commitment of the global community for the 1.5 limit. For that, we need to reduce emissions by 45% on average by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. But what is more frightening, in fact, is that small or specific initiatives led by major countries. For example, Major Economies Forum by the US. About 20 nations account for 80% of all global emissions, right? Well, if you look at the United Nations, we have almost 200 nations or partners. Well, and if each nation takes 1 minute or 5 minutes to talk about their stance, well, it'll take so much time or days. So just getting the results from this kind of big conference is just so difficult. So there are other initiatives that is including small number of major countries. For example, the US is saying that major economies will make a promise that, for example, new cars to be sold in the market should be all electronic vehicles by a certain date. Well, for example, if they set that kind of initiative for major economies, then these major economies work so hard to achieve that goal, and it'll make great impact on Earth. And there are other initiatives presented by the EU as well. Most importantly, Carbon Border Adjustment Measures, or CBAM. With this initiative, the EU is saying that they will not import product from environmentally harmful countries. For example, they can add tariffs on products imported from those kind of countries. And Germany is doing or launching another initiative too, G7 Climate Club. As a chair country of the G7, Germany created this climate club. So if a nation is really active in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it can join as a member for this climate club. And if you become a member of the club, you will get some benefits. And if you're not a member, you will get some disadvantage. Well, there are no specific rules or information on this yet regarding the benefits and disadvantages, but Germany is working on this. And another thing here you can see on the screen is PPCA. PPCA is to end coal-based power generation by 2030. So there are various initiatives across the nation. And another thing that you have to focus on is the concept of ESG. You are all familiar with RE100, right? So you have to produce your goods 100% based on renewables. And also there are other initiatives like EV100. Like for example, a company can claim that all vehicles running in our company will be 100% EV. And World Economic Forum, or the Davos Forum, is also presenting First Movers Coalition, or FMC. This as a new platform for companies to harness their purchasing power and supply chains to create early markets for innovative clean energy technologies. When they buy materials from certain companies, or when they sell their product to some customers, they have to think about the environment. So basically, they are making some commitment to create green and sustainable supply chain. And here, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Well, I told you, the UK, one day we collected all participants from the financial sector, So the financial institutes were brought into one place, and the UK government said, if you are making investment in non-eco-friendly or non-green project, we will not support you. So this was one of the initiatives done by the UK as well. So this is the global trend. And the Korea's NDC by 2030 is minus 40% from 2018. And Korea is making a lot of effort for this. And we have to be part of various initiatives that I just shared with. It will require a lot of effort and painful process. And as I told you before, 2030 and 2050, these years are really critical milestones. They set some milestones for this. And Busan declared that Busan Expo, 2030 Busan Expo, Busan declared that we will host the 2030 Global Expo. And because 2030 is really critical year, we have to think about sustainability and sustainable living with the nature when we are designing that conference. So Busan will become the leader in this effort, and I will look forward to further discussions.
함께 해주셨습니다.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. Since the Paris Agreement, the international society is setting ESG as a new standard or governance standard. Moving on, we'll invite to hear the ESG strategy in New Zealand. So, Philip Tunner, Ambassador of New Zealand to Korea, was supposed to give a presentation, but on behalf of him, Mr. Park Chung-min will give a presentation. Do you hear me okay? Yes, thank you. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Deliver my speech in English today, given the speech that Ambassador Turner was meant to give was in English, but I trust that there's good translation services. My name is John Park, and as explained before, I'm the Deputy Head of Mission at the New Zealand Embassy here in Seoul. It's unfortunate that my ambassador contracted COVID at the most inopportune time. Like climate change, one of the bigger issues that we're grappling with in the world. However, thank you to the conference organisers for allowing me to deliver the speech on his behalf. So talking about the conference and the issues that we're talking about, climate change and ESG, they cannot come at a more pressing time for the world. Ambassador Kim alluded to a lot of the issues that the world is facing and what the world is doing in response. And my Prime Minister is the same. So our Prime Minister called climate change the biggest challenge of our time recently. And she, alongside the other world leaders, had pledged, following on from the Paris Agreement, to act with urgency to reduce global carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. You know, we're a Pacific nation, New Zealand, and talking about New Zealand would have to talk about the Pacific too. Countries in the Pacific are particularly vulnerable to climate change, as some of you may know. I have done a posting in the Pacific in Vanuatu, and I've seen firsthand the negative impacts that climate change has had on the Pacific. And for the Pacific, it's an existential threat on their livelihoods, the natural environment, on resources. I was there when Tropical Cyclone Pam hit in 2015, and the aftermath of that was devastating for the country as a whole. And you would have heard many people talking about sea level change and how some of the lower-lying atolls and islands in the Pacific, if that continues at its going rate, may not exist anymore. So, in New Zealand, climate change is also causing coastal erosion, disrupting biodiversity and melting glaciers. And the need to take action has become a bipartisan priority. At the same time, we look at Korea, and Korea is on an increasingly green trajectory. And we look at Korea as an example. Last year, it became the 14th country in the world to legislate carbon neutrality by 2050. And they're also taking the lead on, and you may have heard from other speakers, on ESG. This meeting and conference and event is therefore a valuable opportunity to profile the important role of ESG in combating climate change. So, why is ESG important in combating climate change? It's gaining momentum globally, so there's a consensus in some of the key issues to address. There are non-financial performance indicators that are being used to determine and evaluate corporate sustainability and responsibility. It's not just about the bottom dollar. ESG-centered corporate strategies create long-term value through focus on ethical, social, and environmental, and the economic dimensions of doing business. This has been driven by demand from beneficiaries and stakeholders, pressure from regulators, and increased expectations by customers to consider the adverse impacts of investments on the society and environment. The clear message is that companies need to act responsibly and contribute to the betterment of society, rather than simply considering profits. This brings me to why ESG is an important role in combating climate change. In the context of climate change, ESG encourages sustainable practices by companies to mitigate their negative environmental impacts. Actions could range from using recycled paper for company products to developing green office buildings with solar panels. Investors are now actively focusing on whether companies contribute to global warming or help reduce it. As such, the ESG movement is now at the forefront of global efforts by countries to decarbonize and become more sustainable. It's a reflection that the benefits of embracing the ESG movement are very real. ESG measures have the power to slow climate change, but also ensure that the transition to a carbon-free society is equitable. The concept is also challenging businesses to think hard about issues such as waste management, privacy, employee welfare, and diversity, just to name a few. Ultimately, companies that are proactive in managing ESG-related risks and opportunities will create value for their stakeholders. But companies that fail to embrace the ESG movement may face losing access to capital investment, along with reputational damage and investor backlash. So, looking to New Zealand as an example, what's the important role of ESG there? As in other parts of the world, there's growing interest in New Zealand in doing more to accelerate towards the goal of strong and consistent ESG reporting. Although New Zealand does not have a government-mandated ESG reporting framework or standard, a climate-first approach to reporting is being taken. One significant development has been New Zealand's introduction of a mandatory climate-related financial disclosure regime last year, first of its kind. This new law requires the financial sector to disclose the impacts of climate change on their business and explain how they'll manage climate-related risks and opportunities. It will require around 200 large financial institutions in New Zealand to start making climate-related disclosures beginning as early as next year. These include banks, investment managers, insurers, and Crown financial institutions with greater than $1 billion in total assets under management, and all equity and debt issues listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. Currently, organisations in New Zealand provide limited information on the implications of climate change risks to their business or are reporting in inconsistent ways. Mandating climate-related financial disclosures is therefore expected to achieve greater transparency, enable climate risk to be adequately priced in capital markets, and help the government achieve its zero carbon target by 2050. In addition, there are a range of other voluntary and mandated corporate reporting that relates to ESG and climate change objectives. One example is the use of sustainable product labelling, such as the Fair Trade mark, to communicate sustainability factors to consumers at the point of sale. The uptake of this has increased in the last decade, along with a deeper understanding of environmental and social risks for businesses. The New Zealand Stock Exchange Corporate Governance Code adopts a comply and explain model for sustainability disclosures. Under this model, companies are expected to disclose their sustainability performance unless they have a legitimate reason not to. Where companies have a legitimate reason not to disclose, they are expected to explain why they haven't. To demonstrate leadership on climate action, the New Zealand government has also announced a carbon neutral government program. In 2020, that aims to make the government carbon neutral by 2025. This requires entities in the public sector to set credible gross emissions reduction targets and plans for 2025 and 2030 and publicly report against them. New Zealand Indigenous culture and our history and our heritage is very important. We've benefited from Motorongo Māori, the cultural intelligence of the Indigenous people of New Zealand. The obligation is to partner with them in developing corporate reporting standards. Many Māori businesses already voluntarily report on ESG outcomes. For example, Ngāti Haua uses Tangata Taio Entikanga, which translates to people, environment and culture, to report on activities and achievements. Similarly, many Māori businesses already operate with long-term horizons and wider social and environmental aspirations. We're looking after the land, supporting communities, and regenerating ecosystems are a core part of their work. So there's a strong business case to undertake sustainability reporting to better understand, rather than focusing on a narrow set of financial indicators. The direction of travel for New Zealand is clear, and there are roles that governments can play to accelerate the transition towards an effective ESG reporting regime. So for New Zealand, as an example, we now look to Korea. And we've been very impressed by how quickly Korea has embraced the ESG movement. In a society where big business is such a big part of the country's trajectory, they've taken a lead as well. It's a reflection that Korea remains one of the world's largest emitters of CO2 and importers of coal, a status that detracts from Korea's overall success, however. For those of us who live in Seoul, worsening air pollution and extreme weather, as Ambassador Kim noted, the recent record rainfall is an example. Heat waves and typhoons have brought home the reality of reliance on fossil fuels, and which is why I believe the ESG movement has tangible value, and I think why the government and industry in Korea have identified this. It gives Korea the opportunity to change the status quo, grow export competitiveness, and respond to growing climate consciousness, both domestically and internationally. It's a way for Korea to turn its 2050 carbon neutral target into real measurable actions across both the public and private sectors. Our shared interest in ESG also presents shared opportunities. Businesses in both countries will be working actively in the ESG space, such as on developing low or carbon-free products that reduce carbon emissions and eco-friendly packaging that reduces waste. At the same time, both countries can draw on their respective strengths to complement each other. One tangible opportunity I'd like to highlight is Korea's development of a hydrogen economy. Korea's search for international partners to fulfill this ambition provides New Zealand with opportunities in hydrogen production, transportation, and the development of hydrogen fuel cells. In particular, we believe New Zealand may have a competitive advantage in green hydrogen production, and we hope, given Korea's demand for that, we could one day export it to Korea. Cooperation with Korea also gives New Zealand a stronger understanding of the viability of a hydrogen economy and export market, including the economics of export hydrogen, infrastructure, and the benefits of scale that can be leveraged. Another example I'd like to highlight is the growth of the zero waste movement. COVID has resulted in the rapid growth of e-commerce in Korea, but also the increased production and use of plastic packaging. I was encouraged to see the Korean government propose new regulations in response to minimize waste generation through restrictions on packaging. I'm proud that New Zealand is already ahead of most economies on such waste reduction. We've already banned single-use plastic bags in 2019, taking the lead from some of our smaller island counterparts, and are moving to ban more plastics, including cotton buds, packaging, cutlery, straws, and fruit labels. By 2025, New Zealand will have banned single-use plastics. So there are many opportunities for New Zealand and Korea to work together on ESG, and we look forward to exploring these in the future more. I'd like to conclude by noting again that Korea is well on its way towards building a more climate resilient economy. But I believe it can go further and become a true climate champion through ESG, one that New Zealand can look to aspirationally and as a cooperative partner. I'd like to congratulate the Global Networks for the Blue Planet and Busan Metropolitan City for providing this opportunity to profile the importance of ESG and climate actions in both our countries and highlight ways we can work together in the future. And I look forward to this conference becoming a regular feature. Thank you very much.
네, 함께 해주신 공관차석님.
Once again, thank you for your great speech. New Zealand is definitely a leader in the ESG field, and Korea is also a leader. So we can have a lot of cooperation in the future. And the last speaker for this session is Professor Yong-Sik Ok, Co-President of International ESG Association. He is an expert in UN SDG, and he is a well-recognized researcher, particularly as a HCR. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Good afternoon. I am Yong-Sik Ok, professor of Korea University. In December in Malaysia, we had a serious flood. It killed about 53 people. In New Jersey, America, Hurricane Ida killed a lot of people too. The governor there said that the sky opened last night, and it began to throw a Nigerian fall into the city. And in July last year, we had a serious heat wave in Greece causing various wildfires that was really hard to contain. And that wildfire was not only in Greece, it was also found in Turkey and many other neighboring countries. And Ambassador Hyun Kim mentioned very important information. IPCC report, annual report, said that climate change is definitely anthropogenic crisis. According to its AR number 5, global warming is an absolute fact, and the reason behind it is lying on the people. So what you are seeing here is the head of the Nature website. So the Nature journal is covering extreme heat waves, and this is causing a lot of disruption in transportation and economies across the world. The wildfire, flood, and many other extreme weather events are affecting the people. In the winter, we might have serious cold wave as well. So we need to prepare for that. So there are 7 major physical risks to the mankind or to the planet. Ambassador Kim mentioned this earlier, so I'm just going to skip this. But I would like to tell you that I share the same idea on this. ESG and climate change. They are 2 important concepts and ideas. ESG investment in Korea is about 531 trillion won. That is about 35.9% of the total investment made in Korea. And if you think about the investors' interest, the total ESG investment globally will reach about $130 trillion. The total GDP of Korea is 1.6 trillion, so that is almost 10 times the GDP of Korea. So that is massive amount. So that means that probably all investment vehicles in the future will consider ESG as a very important component. So when companies do their business, it is just inevitable for them to incorporate ESG concept into their operations. Global money will flow into the ESG investing, and to make it more meaningful, businesses and their operations need to be truly based on ESG. And how green or how sustainable their operations are can be determined based on EU taxonomy. The most famous criteria for ESG evaluation at the moment. So if we provide clear criteria and standards based on the taxonomy, companies can do a better job in greening their operations. So in the same note, the Korean government created a K taxonomy as well. To dive into more deeper, I'm going to talk about financial risks linked with climate change. If a company is doing good in responding to climate change, for example, if a company makes a battery based on renewable energy, their corporate value rises. For example, look at Tesla. Tesla stock price or market cap increased by 145 times compared to 10 years ago. What it says is that the customer and the people believe that Tesla might do a good job in the future. But the real reason behind this is that the investors and customers or stock investors believe that Tesla does not really have climate-related risks. So that is why their corporate value is rising. So how green a company is or how sustainable a company is became really critical for investors. We do have a global initiative that recognizes that climate change can undermine financial performance of a company. So when you consider climate change, you have to think about first transitional risk. You can find it on the left box here. So if there are some transitional trends or changes in a society, many things in society and the economy change. The company will change their structure and policies, and consumers will change their belief. And another risk that you have to think about is physical risk. If you fail to respond to climate change, for example, in the short term, you will be exposed to extreme weather events, for example, and then in the long term, you will fail in your operations due to some long-term chronic risks. And you also have to apply micro and macro lenses when you interpret economic transmission in the society. And considering all that, you can identify financial risks in the end. That are listed on the very right section here. So the financial risks include credit risk, market risk, underwriting risk, and many others. So good example here is Samsung. Samsung made the SDI Sustainability Report in 2019, trying to understand their climate change-related risks so that they can set up mid to long-term strategies to fight that. So we also had financial institutes taking concerted actions against climate risks. In total, 112 financial institutes participated in this event, making a strong commitment to various issues like decarbonization, TCFD, and CDP. Well, these are important concepts that I would like to give more explanation, but we don't have enough time for this, so I'm just going to skip it. But I hope that I have other opportunities to talk about this later. And I do believe that climate change is really important, but what is more important is biodiversity. Environmental issues like biodiversity loss or contained water. These are critical and directly related to the operation of businesses. So climate change is the most frequently discussed issue, but the loss of biodiversity is really, really important too. Why? Well, let's take a look at the example of POSCO International. Indian companies filed a lawsuit against POSCO International, and also investors that are making investment in POSCO International. This slide is talking about the palm tree oil farm that's built by the POSCO International in Indonesia. And this farm is causing serious forest degradation and water contamination. And what you are seeing here is that, of course, POSCO Holdings and POSCO International are different companies. And as you can see that POSCO does have severe risks when it comes to climate change. So what this is saying is that they are not doing so well on the E pillar of the ESG. But in contrary, the Basque is doing such a great job on the E pillar. So that's something that we have to learn from. And biodiversity is as important as climate change, as I told you earlier. And the fact that POSCO decided to participate in the TNFD, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is a testament to that. The TNFD was established last year, and in just 1 year, BHD and BlackRock and many major international financial institutes are participating in this. And 13 governments, including Australia, are member of this task force. And my company is also a member of this. So I'm going to do a lot more study on this. So anyways, global risk landscape is giving a increasingly more emphasis on biodiversity. So we need to make some more effort to protect biodiversity. And TNFD and TCFD is different. They are different. TNFD is more comprehensive, and TNFD is about creating a financial data based on businesses' operations and their impact on the environment. So it is more financial related data. And it was mentioned earlier by Chairman Che. It is true that we do have too many ESG rating agencies, causing a lot of confusion. In Korea, we have Naver, SK, and many other rating agencies here. But we are also referring to information from S&D, Thomson, Reuters, and many other rating providers. So it's really hard to respond to all these different classification criteria. So we do have rating providers, and we do have international organizations that provide standards too. So most famous rating providers are like PwC and KPMG. And I can classify that Bloomberg and Thomson are fundamental rating providers. But True Value Labs and many others are the rating providers that use objective criteria but also subjective criteria. They do add a lot of subjective ideas on their reporting. And Equalab is another ratings provider that has a different concept about the rating. So with all that, what should we do? Well, I gave you some examples of Korean large companies, but now I'm going to talk about Coca-Cola. The Coca-Cola company does have a very serious risk. This is one of the companies that produce the largest number of plastic package. And we can learn some lessons from them. Like BASF, that is focusing on biodiversity, Coca-Cola and their stakeholders recognize the importance of reducing plastic package. So Coca-Cola's reaction or strategy to collect or recycle plastic package is working really well. They have built a lot of partnership for recycling and reusing and reducing plastic package, and their efforts and actions are surely something that we can take some lessons from. So managing risk is really important for all companies, and for that, probably we need to have strong initiatives. In Korea, we do have a very diverse classification of industries. And for each industry, there are things to consider. Steel industry needs to think about the water quality and biodiversity. So the steel companies in Korea need to internalize this issue. And this is the last slide of my presentation. Well, before we focused on development, but now the focus is more on the environment. We need to change the paradigm for the industry. This is the homepage of the Harvard University. And what's more important here from this slide is that do well is important, but do good is also important. And they are not, they can go hand in hand. If you're doing well and if you're doing good, you can create an excellent result. That is about the triple bottom line concept. Thank you for listening.
네, 오경식 교수님 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Ok. You provided many case studies on risk management. So companies need to go from do well to good too. So we heard all three lectures and presentations, and we'll move right on to the discussion. So will Professor Ambassador Kim Hyo-eun and Mr. Park Chung-min from the New Zealand Embassy, as well as Professor Ok Yong-sik. Through this discussion, we'll cover many different points on this theme, and we're receiving a lot of comments online as well regarding this theme. Again, Ambassador Kim will serve as moderator for this discussion session. Please welcome them with a big hand.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you again. With regard to ESG and climate action, there are some global trends, and New Zealand is making efforts, and Professor Ok also mentioned that companies do have visions and strategies to respond to this trend. So all presentations and speeches were so excellent. So I would like to thank all the speakers again. And yes, ESG is surely a global trend. It goes beyond the trend, actually. It is a global norm or a rule. It's something inevitable. We can't go back anymore. And it is a very important issue for the future generations. And when I attended the Glasgow meeting last year, I could see that the youth was very active in this effort. And I am particularly so happy to have this event in the campus of Dongseol University in Busan. And I do have a lot of talk with the youth, and there was a message from them that I want to share with you. They say we are not future generations. Climate change is something that is the most important issue for us. The results of the climate change will greatly affect our life. So when it comes to climate change, we are not the future generation. We are the generation that has to deal with the climate change. So we are not living in the future. We are living today, and our life will rely on the result of climate change. That really touched my heart. And when I am working and when I make effort to tackle the climate change, I do think that the youth and the younger generations need to be the major player in the discussion. It is really true. And once again, I feel they are so important. And in that sense, I would like to have a talk with Professor Ok. You are directly communicating with the students, right, every day. So what do you think? How do you feel the passion of the youth when it comes to ESG or climate change? Are they really interested in this issue? And if we want to encourage them to make more actions, particularly from young students, what should we do? Any ideas? Well, I think you just mentioned a very, very important thing. I can't remember exactly, but probably last week or so, I had a meeting. I attended a conference on ESG for the youth. So if you go to visit a website of the conference, you'll see what I said there. Well, yes, like you said, I am a professor working with the students. But today and every day we witness an increasing number of experts in ESG. Many universities are making research lab or classes and courses for ESG management. And many universities are making various declarations and ceremonies for ESG. But I think that there is a weak consensus among students on this issue. As a researcher and professor, I do think fundamentals are really important. Well, I gave you the example of Coca-Cola earlier. If companies in Korea really do care about the environment, companies need to establish research labs or so. Many companies are trying to change their names and brands using the concept of environment, trying to show the public that they care for the environment. However, there are not many companies with a strong group of experts or teams specialized in the environment or sustainability. So I think that businesses need to evaluate and determine and define what is the most important thing for their operation. And it applies to universities too. The dean, the professors, students, and staff members, and the local community of the universities, all these interest parties may be able to define what is most important for them. And then they have to build a consensus on that. So when they have this strong consensus, they can create a data, and that data can provide some qualitative information or analysis. So based on that, one university, for example, can determine the most important problem that we have to solve this year in our school is, for example, waste treatment. So when they have this specific data and goal, they can have better events or philosophies or programs. However, this is not being done so well in Korea or in companies and universities yet. I am running an association, ARPU. I am part of this association, and 5 universities are the member of this. And recently, the Busan National University joined this association of over 260 universities in the Asian Pacific region. So the association recently created a course for ESG. This course is delivered in English, actually, and it involves some experts from from Singapore and so on. So in fact, not many Korean students are taking interest in this course, but this course is really informative and helpful. So if you're interested in this, you can visit their website or YouTube channel, or you can also contact me. And go to the website called 이상한 대학 or Awkward University in translation. So if you go there, you will be able to see the speech that I delivered at the conference. So please visit the website and check it out.
는 청년의 참여를 강화하기 위해서 어떤 노력들을 기울이고 있는지 조금 들어보면 좋을 것 같습니다. So Mr. Park, I'd like to invite your view about what actions and efforts New Zealand government and universities, other shareholders are making to invite youth, young generation as a mainstream of climate action. Please share your view. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Ambassador. And I'll keep my response quite short, but what I would say is that the New Zealand youth have taken the initiatives onto themselves. I don't know if you saw in the news, it actually made worldwide global news that the New Zealand Youth for Climate protests last, I think, in April to June 2021 were covered worldwide, and it was a large-scale high school-led protest, possibly inspired by Greta Thunberg, a Swedish the youth who's become world notorious around the world. But what that did was it kind of enforced how the youth felt like they weren't being listened to, or that climate action was too slow, or the government wasn't listening to them. And while that's not fully 100% the case, what it did do is our climate minister met the youth leaders of that protest movement following that. And we really agree with, I also agree with the professor as well, that, you know, fundamentals and understanding and the basic understanding of what we can do on climate change and what the problems are is the key aspect. And what that does is create a dialogue between youth and the government and industry as well as to what we can do together. There'll be a number of steering committees and governance committees and dialogue committees that are put together where we always have youth representation as to what they can do. And as you can see from the protests, that they're not scared to take action. And it's about realizing that it's not just the big things. Whilst the big industries and the big businesses, you know, and lean on legislators to make things like doing the reports on climate change, on the effects their companies have on climate change, and reporting on ESG. The youth doing things like small, ensuring recycling is done properly, waste reduction, small things like that, walking, biking initiatives where the use of fossil fuels and motor vehicles are reduced. All these little things add up, and I think the youth have a big part to play in that.
네, 감사합니다. 예, 다음은
Thank you. And why don't we talk about changes in consumption pattern? Many nations have to develop different policies and strategies, and companies need to revise their strategies, right? So we talked about that a lot during the session. The strong climate action is needed, and for it to become really useful, individuals' consumption pattern needs to change when it comes to using power or consuming energy or buying goods or even your daily life habits. We all need to make changes in your daily life. We need different life patterns for strong climate action to be effective. And I know it's not easy, it's not convenient. Making actions for climate change reduction, climate change mitigation in your daily life is not something easy to do. And many individuals do not want to make changes in their life, and I do understand why. So basically, you know, the mankind likes to get some incentives when they do something. So making regulations can work, but on the other hand, probably we need to provide incentives to encourage changes from individuals. So the government needs to set some regulations to limit certain activities, but we can also provide benefits or incentives to encourage positive changes. So Professor Oak, To encourage students to make actions in climate action, do universities try to incorporate incentives or any other creative tools? Thank you for a great question. I think I might want to put it more narrowly. So voluntary emission trading system is one thing to mention. For example, from universities, we do have a lot of plastic waste. There are actually various types of plastic. So some can be recycled and upcycled. So if they recycle and reuse it, and if they produce new goods out of them, they can get some right to emit CO2 in the future. So that kind of trading system is one area that students are showing interest in. And to make this system more effective, I believe that we have to build a stronger consensus among interest parties of the university, like dean, staff members, and students. Many universities say, the dean of universities say that we do pursue sustainability, or we do value SDG. Like we do have SDG related courses and programs, and even SDG college. And now the talk of the town is not SDG exactly. They are focusing more on ESG. And some professors are now saying like, well, I spent my entire life to study SDG, and now they're talking about ESG, and I don't like this. However, I think that sustainability and ESG, ESG is something that is based on data-driven analysis. And ESG has 3 different pillars, E, S, G pillars. Environment, social, and governance. But even some people do not even clearly understand the basic concept of each pillar either. But ESG and SDG are different. Actually, SDG can be classified into E, S, and G. So they are interconnected in many ways. They are not different or separate concepts. And earlier we talked about the difference of CSR and ESG, and I like that discussion actually, because understanding the fundamental concept of each is really important. And another area of interest for the students in my university is waste management, recycling, and upcycling. And as far as I understand, this conference does have a lot of linked events like exhibitions on that theme, so I like that too.
Or cases of New Zealand in order to mobilize people's strong participation in climate action. So what kind of policies or initiatives does New Zealand government or the society is taking? If you share specific cases, it would be very helpful, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. So there's been a number of examples where the government or institutions have taken action. So broadly, you may have been aware of our clean vehicle purchase rebate. So up to a maximum of $8,500 New Zealand dollars, if if you purchase a fully electronic vehicle, you can apply for that rebate from the government. So it's a financial incentive to use clean vehicles. And that goes down as a scale version to hybrid vehicles as well. And the hope is that as more electric vehicles, because I know there's a supply issue at the moment, become imported to New Zealand, that people will take advantage of that rebate. Because one of the complaints, of course, like you say, is expense is a thing for households in New Zealand. So if electric vehicles expense doesn't come down, that rebate should help. There's also trialled a new system in the public sector as a first, because of course the government likes being guinea pigs. They've enabled a subsidy program for electric bicycles. So any bicycles or electric bicycles to encourage the use of non-fossil fuel transport, public sector workers can get a 50% subsidy on the purchase of some of these bicycles. So that's been taken up very highly by public servants around the country. So I'm sure there's a big group of low emitters in Wellington, our capital, where all of our government buildings are. Universities have also taken individual initiatives. So they call it sustainable purchasing and waste management. And I think most of our universities have taken up on that. So most of the stores, food outlets, for example, on university campuses, they need to meet a certain standard of recycling, non-waste, recyclable packaging, non-single-use plastic to be able to trade on the universities. And of course, waste management is a big issue where students and the universities work together to ensure that upcycling, recycling and waste management is done properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing very specific cases of New Zealand in order to incentivize the people to participate proactively in strong climate action. By the way, 근데 오경식 교수님 또 간단하게 추가하시고 싶으신 내용이 있으신가?
네, 제가 아까 전에 이제 학생들 얘기를 하다가 오늘 기조 강연.
Yes, so we're talking about the youth, and actually the EPI that was covered by the keynote speaker is actually being covered in my classroom a lot. So it has many indicators, and when it comes to ecosystem, Korea's ranking is so low. We are close to African countries. We are ranked at 70 actually, and the reason behind it is the lack of eco-farming. If you go to UN SDG website, and if you check the rank of South Korea, you can check that life and water sector, Korea is ranked so low. And actually, if we rank higher on this list, it means that we have higher reputation and higher economic power in the globe, on the globe. So I'm saying that environment crisis and issues are not risks but opportunities. So I hope that the government and relevant institutes need to focus on this to help the youth and businesses in that regard.
그 생태 농업, 생물 다양성 이 중요성 강조해 주셨는데 저도 그 특히 개발도상국들하고 기후변화 협력에 관한 이야기를 해보면 많은 국가들이 농업, 산림, 수산업 이런 1차 산업 분야에서의 협력을 굉장히
I agree. The importance of biodiversity is really important, and I do believe that universities need to show more leadership, and we need to share such values and ideas with developing countries in cooperation with many governments. Well, I guess that time is up, so we might have to end the session here. Thank you for your participation and great insight.
네, 이렇게 세션 1
This concludes session 1, Climate Crisis Policies and Policies. We'll start session 2, ESG Investment, at 2 p.m. Korea time. Thank you very much.